Resourceful Designer, Episode 87, Mastering Your Emotional Intelligence.
Welcome to the Resourceful Designer podcast, offering solutions to streamline your graphic and web design business so you can get back to designing. And now, your host. He knows the Weird Al lyrics better than he does the original lyrics. Mark DeCote.
Welcome to the podcast. I am so glad you've joined me today, as I have a very interesting topic, and that's how to deal with emotional intelligence. Now, emotional intelligence is not a term that's very popular, and you may not have heard of it. But hopefully, after today's episode, it'll be something that you will keep in mind, and if done correctly, will help you gain and retain your clients. But before I get to that, I want to share a little bit of what's been happening in my life. Now, as you may have known if you've been listening to the podcast or if you're in the Facebook group, I was off a couple of weeks ago to Anaheim, California for Podcast Movement. It's a huge podcasting conference. This was my third time attending one, and I had a great time. Well, I came back last week and my wife was still off, so I decided to take a second week off. So I've been off for 2 weeks, and this week being Labor Day week, Monday was a holiday, so Tuesday, it ends up being a short week this week. So Tuesday was my first day back. Now, I had anticipated having 2 websites were my main jobs. I was thinking about that the 2 weeks I was off. There was 2 websites that I had started beforehand that I really had to finish. My clients knew I was going away for 2 weeks, so that wasn't a big issue, but I wanted to get to them and get them done. Well, of course, 2 weeks are up. I got back to my desk on Monday and started sifting through everything. And just like you would expect, there was a lot more work to do than just 2 websites to work on. I had a lot of emails to sift through, a lot of new work, and some rushes and pressing stuff to take care of. So I absolutely love it. You know, it's great to take some time off and unwind, and then you come back with revigoration and you have all this work to dive into. And yes, I still have those 2 websites. I'm working on them. I got one of them yesterday, almost finished. The other one I'm just touching on a little bit today. But all this other stuff added to my to-do list of jobs to work on. So as I said, I'm just loving it. Now, as always, I want to start the episode off with a tip of the week this week. Not a resource, it's a tip. And this tip is, once you're done working on a client project, especially if it's a new client, but even old clients, why not send them a thank you card? And I don't mean a thank you email or a phone call. I mean a physical thank you card in the mail. Now, I mentioned before in the podcast how it's a great idea and you should be following up with your clients after a project is done. Wait a couple of weeks and then find out how everything went. But at that same time, why not send them a physical thank you card? This will go a long way in building your client relationship. I'm always talking about client relationships. Well, a thank you card received in the mail is something that will be remembered. An email that you get thanking somebody or somebody thanking you, you say, oh, well, that's nice. And then you either delete it or file away, and you probably don't think about it again. But when you receive something in the mail, especially in this day and age, it used to be something common. You would receive handwritten notes or cards in the mail all the time. But in this day and age, they've become much less common, and they will go a long way in being remembered. So a client, especially a new client that you've completed a job for, just sending a thank you card that they can physically hold is something that will create a response from them that will make them want to come back to you in the future. Not to mention, you are a designer. So this is a chance for you to show off your design skills and do something that the client is not dictating. If you designed a logo for them or a website for them or whatever, they had a certain idea of what they wanted. Well, this thank you card is a chance for you to design something for yourself and show your skills. And who knows, maybe the client will say, wow, what a great idea. Can you design a thank you card for me to send out to my clients? So it could turn into a win-win situation. So that's this week's tip of the week. Send out a physical thank you card. All it costs you is a couple of pennies for the card and your stamp. And now, mastering your emotional intelligence. So what exactly is emotional intelligence? Well, according to Psychology Today, emotional intelligence is the ability to identify and manage your own emotions and the emotions of others. It's the capacity to be aware of, control, and express your emotions and to handle interpersonal relationships judiciously and empathetically. In other words, emotional intelligence impacts your thinking and behavior when dealing with your clients, and it's a crucial part to building client relationships. I mean, it's a given. Client satisfaction and repeat business is based on an emotional connection with you, the designer. If a client likes you, they're more likely to hire you again. And liking you is all based on emotions. And that's why emotional intelligence is something you should be aware of at all times when dealing with your clients, because those relationships are the foundation to your design business. Way back in episode 20 of Resourceful Designer that you can find by visiting resourcefuldesigner.com/episode 20, it was titled Building Relationships with Your Graphic Design Clients. And I went into great detail on various ways to build those relationships. Well, emotional intelligence is crucial to those building blocks. So how does emotional intelligence work with your design business? Well, being aware of your emotional intelligence means being aware that emotions can impact your behavior and they can also impact other people's behavior, both positively and negatively. The way you react to a client when you're talking to them or they're talking to you is going to create an emotional response from them. And what you want is positive emotions from your clients, because positive emotions will build that trust that you want them to build in you. And learning how to manage those emotions, both your own emotions and those of other people, you can manage their emotions. Learning how to do that is a key part in building relationships with those design clients. How you respond to them when they criticize you or when they question you or just anything they say, how you respond to them is all built on the emotional intelligence foundation. And the same goes the other way around, how they respond to you. But if you can identify it, then you can isolate those negative emotions, put them aside, and work on the positive emotions. So here are a few tips I put together on improving your emotional intelligence. First off, you need to learn to be self-aware of your own emotions. Think about how your emotions have affected the way you react in various situations. Are you the type of person who is always on the defensive? If somebody tells you that they don't like your design, do you automatically jump to, well, why? What's the matter with it? Or are you the type of person that says, okay, that's fine. You don't have to like it, but tell me why. Tell me what's wrong with it or what you don't like about it. If you're the type of person who's always defensive about it, then learning to recognize these defensive emotions, these negative emotions, can greatly help you in building your business. Because sometimes a response from a client, not necessarily emotional response, but just a general critique or a question or anything from the client can be taken in various ways. A client that simply says, I don't like this design, may not be talking about the entire design. They might be talking about one small part of it that is bothering them. And you have to learn how to isolate these sort of things and work through the emotions that you feel in order to come to the proper solution. Remember back in episode 84 when I talked about how you're a problem solver? Well, that problem solving has to do with emotions as well. You have to make sure that your clients, if they have negative emotions, they don't end up creating negative emotions in you. You have to find a way to turn their negative emotions into positive emotions. Which brings me on to tip number 2. And that is, you need to take responsibility for your feelings and your behavior. When somebody criticizes you or challenges you, rather than taking offense, ask yourself, what can I learn from this situation? If a client tells you that a design you made for them is horrible, you might react in a negative way. Or you can stop and think, okay, what can I learn from this situation? What makes this design horrible in their mind? And as I said earlier, it might not be the entire design. It might just be one thing. I mentioned last episode, and I've mentioned before about my one client who doesn't like green. She will look at a design and just go, no, I don't like this. And I could immediately know that if I included green in the design, that might be all it is changing the green to another color. And all of a sudden it would be fixed. So you have to find the solutions, be the problem solver, and get beyond the emotions of reacting negatively to a negative emotion from your client and possibly turn them around to a positive emotion. If they say, I don't like this design, then get to the bottom of what it is they don't like. Is it the entire design? Do they just not like anything about it? Or is it the font they don't like? Is it the imagery? Is it the positioning? Is it the color? What is it they don't like? And sometimes it's right diving very deep. You design a logo for a client and they say, oh, I really don't like this font. Well, instead of going through and saying, oh, well, that was the font I really had in mind for that logo, and now I'm going to have to go and find another one. Talk it through with the client. What is it about the font they don't like? Sometimes they might just say, well, I imagined something a little bit more finesse or delicate, and this font is just way too bold and presumptuous. Well, maybe it's just a matter of switching from the bold version of that font family to the semi-bold or the regular or medium. And that might be all it takes. Not necessarily changing the font, just changing the look of it a little bit might be enough to turn the tide and have that client now like that logo. So when a client reacts with a certain emotion, you need to see through it and learn to identify ways to read what the client is saying and not react emotionally yourself. Now, on the same lines, if a client says something and you do react emotionally and you somehow hurt somebody's feelings or say something that you might regret or you do regret, offer a sincere apology. That goes a long way in mending any cracks that you may have formed in the relationship. If you can identify and acknowledge that you stepped out of bounds or you said something you shouldn't have, then you don't have to worry. You can move along and move past that situation simply by apologizing. Now, another tip when dealing with emotional intelligence is to learn how to respond to a situation rather than react to it. Reacting to a situation typically involves an emotional behavior. You're happy, you're sad, you're mad, etc. Whereas responding involves deciding how you want to behave. When you react, you're not really thinking about what you're doing. Again, if somebody says, I don't like this design, well, what's wrong with it? That's your first reaction. But if you take the time to respond as opposed to react, then when somebody says, I don't like that design, instead of saying, well, what's wrong with it? Then you can stop, think about this, the question or what they just said, and then say, okay, you don't like the design. Can you tell me what's wrong with it? I mean, you're asking the same thing. It's just the way you do it. The emotions involved in your response are completely different. One way, you're responding to the situation rather than reacting to the situation. Now, all of this I've been talking so far about reacting to something the client says or something you said or did. But there's also ways to improve your emotional intelligence before there's any sort of reaction or response at all. One thing is, anytime you are dealing with a client, you should be in what I like to call a technology-free space or zone or whatever. Whether you're talking on the phone, you're on a Skype or video chat, or you're in person, you need to avoid any sort of distractions that may impact your client emotionally in a negative way. If you're sitting in your client's office discussing a project with them, and your phone rings and you pull out your phone to check who the call display is, that will create a negative emotion with the client, thinking that you're not fully there for them. Even if you just look at it, then turn it off and put it away again, the fact that you pulled it out and looked at your phone creates those negative emotions, even if the client doesn't realize it. I remember being in meetings and my phone goes off in my pocket and the client says, oh, do you need to take that? I won't even look at my phone. I'll reach in my pocket and I'll press the button on the side of my phone that will silence the ring and automatically send it to voicemail. I won't even look to see who called because I am fully focused on my client. And I will let them know that as well. I will say, no, I can get that afterwards. Or I can look to see who called or whoever it is, they'll just leave me a voicemail. Right now, I'm dealing with you. And just that little response now creates a positive emotional behavior in your client. And they don't even realize it, but they just strengthened that relationship between you and them. And again, client relationships is the foundation of your design business. So every little brick that goes into that foundation is a positive for you. So if you're on the phone, silence your computer. Most computers have some sort of volume control on the keyboard. If you pick up your phone to talk to a client, put your computer on silence or mute your computer so that you don't get bings and notification sounds that as you're talking to your client, especially if you're on some sort of video chat with them. The last thing you want is for your email to be going bing, bing every few minutes because you're getting more emails in while you're talking to somebody. So quit your email program while you're video conferencing. Anything that will create a distraction should be eliminated because every little distraction is a negative emotion. Even, as I said, even if the client doesn't realize it, it is affecting them emotionally. The trick is give your client your full devoted attention. Now, I talked about responding to a situation rather than reacting to it. And sometimes that means taking a moment to pause and allow yourself to think before speaking or before acting. This will help you manage your emotions and help you be more thoughtful and less emotional when responding to a situation, especially a bad situation or a negative situation. When a client criticizes something, if you take a second to just pause and think before you speak, it'll go a long way in you, as I said, calming down and responding in a proper way. Not to mention, it actually makes you look more impressive and more professional as a designer, as somebody that the client wants to work with. If you take the time to ponder their questions or to ponder their comments before responding. I've often used this purposely in a client meeting where the client will ask something, and instead of just responding, I'll just kind of look up and make it look like I'm thinking. I'm trying to formulate a response. And whether it was a design-related question or a billing or a cost, a price-related question, just stopping to think and ponder does create the impression that you are more important than somebody who would just blurt out whatever, that you're actually taking the time to contemplate what they asked, what they said, and form a proper response to them. Now, another thing to think of is that in doing all of this, in all your responses, if you increase your empathy towards your client, it'll go a long way in relationship building. If they don't like something, instead of being defensive, find out why they don't like it and empathize with them. Oh, okay, I can see your point of view. I understand that. Well, that's not a big deal. We can change that. Empathize with your client. It doesn't matter how good you think the design is. If the client doesn't like something, then they have a reason. And as I said, you could try to find out what the reason is, and you should. Not just you should try to find out what those reasons are. Is it the color? Is it the font? Is it something to do with the layout? But all through that discovery of figuring out why the client doesn't like something, you need to empathize with them and don't be defensive or that. If you empathize and, okay, you don't like that font. Well, I understand that. Maybe this font isn't the right one, but let's find out what it is about this font. And then we'll work from there. Empathize with them. Simply practice understanding why someone feels or behaves in a certain way, and then communicate that understanding to them. It took me a long time to figure out that one client didn't like the color green. I mean, there was times where she told me, oh, just change this. I don't like this green, change that. But a client can tell you that a bunch of times without it finally clicking in that, wait a minute, not just that she didn't like that green in that layout. She doesn't like green at all. And I know that's an extreme. Not many clients will you have that have that sort of aversion to something. But it took me a while to understand what was affecting her and communicate that understanding to her, saying, here, we're going to do something, but I understand you don't like green. Or if there's a project and she wants something, like say she says, it's an outdoor event and I'd like a photo of a picnic table out, with the river in the background. And I will immediately tell her at that point, before even designing the thing, I know you don't like the color green, but you realize if we're doing this, we're going to have grass in the photo and the grass is green. And then it's up to her to decide, well, can she live with that or not? And in some cases, I actually did a project with her like that. She said, well, yeah, there's nothing we can do about that. Grass is green. I mean, I'm not going to change the color of the grass for her. But we did try to minimize how much grass was shown in the photo, specifically for her needs. As I said, that's an extreme case, but it just means understanding the client, showing some empathy towards them. And it all comes down to emotional intelligence. Now, if this is something, all these things that I've been talking about, if this is something that you think you struggle with, try scheduling a couple of minutes at the end of your day and reflect on your daily actions and how you handled yourself when dealing with your clients. Because we all learn through actions. If you think back to your client interactions that day, and you can identify the areas that you did really well and the areas that you could have done better, then the next time you interact with that client, or the next time you interact with any client, you will be better prepared emotionally to deal with them. Because as I've said several times in this episode, and I've been saying since I started the Resourceful Designer podcast, the relationships you build with your clients are the most important part of your design business. Without those relationships, you don't have a business. In episode 85, Real and Repeat Clients, I mentioned how a client would much rather work with a good designer they like than work with a great designer they don't like. So if you learn to identify and master your emotional intelligence, you will become the designer your clients like. And that's what I wanted to talk about today. Now, how do you struggle with emotional intelligence? Is it a term you've heard of before? Is it something you're even aware of? I would love to hear from you. Please leave a comment for this episode by visiting resourcefuldesigner.com/episode 87. And now, this week's question of the week. This week's question comes in from Travis. Travis says, I just finished the episode on hourly rates, and you brought up the niche topic. I target the church and ministry niche personally, and have several years' experience in this niche. However, it's a niche that typically is not willing to pay standard rates, because they're usually nonprofit. The idea of charging more in this niche seems impossible. Do you have any experience with working for nonprofit clients or any feedback on how to develop good quotes for those nonprofit sectors? Recently, I've been asking them first to let me know what they have budgeted, but they often have no idea what to expect or simply don't know what to budget. I try to help them come up with a good number and then adjust how much time I spend on a project accordingly. Thanks, Travis. Well, thank you very much for the question, Travis. Now, first off the bat, nonprofit does not mean no money. I just want to put that out there. I have worked with several nonprofit companies or businesses or organizations that had huge budgets for their marketing. And that's often the case because a nonprofit has to draw in people with donations or whatever way they get their money. The best way for them to do that is through their marketing. So they often do have some sort of budget. Now, maybe the people you're working with don't know what that budget is, and that's often the case. They will set aside these committees who will work on a project. Well, that committee doesn't necessarily know how much money is available for the project they're working on. And it may mean you have to go above whoever you're dealing with. Go to the head and find out, listen, we're doing this, or have somebody in the committee do this and find out what sort of budget they're working on to see whether or not it is feasible for you to do some work for them. Because you have to remember, you are running a business. You are not a charity. They may be nonprofit, but you are definitely not a nonprofit. So I have worked with nonprofits before. I was on the board of director for our local Habitat for Humanity for years. I've worked with churches. I've worked with other organizations that are all considered nonprofit. And I have never had a problem. I've never discounted my rates. Even when I was working with Habitat, well, actually, when I was on the board for Habitat, I didn't actually do any design for them because I told them they actually got me on the board thinking I would do work for free for them. And that was one of the reasons why they invited me on. But once I was on and I became the chair to their marketing committee, I went out and I hired other designers to do work for us. And I made sure those designers were paid according to their skill and what they should be paid. And we had the budget, we had the money, even though people are saying, oh, let's save some money and that. We definitely had the money to cover that stuff. Now, what I often find with nonprofits is they'll try to get the best price out of you, and they just don't appreciate the services that we as designers have to offer. And you've got to kind of explain when you give them a price and they say, oh, you're too expensive or that, or that, wow, isn't that a lot? They wouldn't question if wherever, say this is a church, if their toilet was overrunning or they had an issue and they called a plumber in, they wouldn't question the plumber's prices. If their front steps were crumbling and they had to get a stonemason in to fix the front steps, they wouldn't question his prices. So why should they be questioning your prices as a designer? You are a service provider, just like a plumber or a stonemason or anybody else. The people that come and clean the windows for the church, they don't question their prices. Why should they be questioning yours? And I don't know your particular situation, Travis, and I don't want to come off sounding insincere or mean or anything like that. But if a certain niche, like you say you work in this church ministry niche, well, if you find that it's too hard to deal with them and they don't have the budget to work with you, or you're always having to discount your prices because they say they can't afford you, then this niche might not be the niche for you. If you are a good designer and you want to make what you deserve to make, you may need to find another niche. Now, I'm not saying that you shouldn't do work for them. If you want to do work for them, that's completely up to you. But if you are relying solely on this niche to make your money, and you're saying that they don't have the money or that's what they're telling you, then I'm afraid that your business is going to suffer for it. So either branch out, find some other niches. If you really want to help these ones, then offer them a discount and then find somewhere else to get an income design-wise where you're not offering a discount, or move away from these niches. There was times where somebody wanted to hire me and I gave them my rate and they would say, well, we can't afford that. And that's fine. If you can't afford it, you can't afford it. I remember years ago, I was talking to the author of a business book, and I can't remember his name. This was back when I worked at the print shop, and I'd been somewhere, and he was signing his book, and I was talking to him, and it was all like how to get ahead in business type book. And he mentioned something about prices to somebody. And somebody had brought up the topic about how, well, I do this and people they just seem like they're always telling me I'm too expensive. And this person I don't think was a designer. I don't remember. As I said, this was years ago. But I'll never forget something that this author said. And he told the person, he said, no, you're not too expensive. They simply can't afford you. And what you need to do is find people who can afford you. And he gave the analogy, I remember, of somebody looking for a car, and somebody who's looking to buy a car and looks at, an Audi or a Ferrari or a Lamborghini. Will look at those cars and they'll say, wow, those cars are way too expensive. Well, yeah, they're too expensive for that person. That person can't afford that car. But there are people out there that can afford a Lamborghini or a Maserati, or even a Mercedes. There are people out there who can afford that. And to them, those cars are not too expensive. So it's a matter of finding your clientele. If you want to make a certain profit, if you want to make a certain amount of money, it's a matter of finding the clientele that can afford you. And if the church and ministry niche can't afford you, then it's a matter of you going out and finding a niche or a sector. It doesn't have to be a niche down like churches or ministry. It could just be in general. Find the clientele that can't afford you. I can honestly say that when I started my business, the clients, although I do have some clients that are still with me from the start, most of the clients that I had when I first started my business are not around anymore because over time I raised my price and I ended up getting a new batch of clients that could afford the new price that I was charging. And the other ones, which were smaller clients, smaller jobs, couldn't afford me anymore. I don't know what happened to them. They found somebody else, and good for them. But now I'm happy dealing with clients that can't afford my current rates. But nonprofits are very tricky, and they will try to any trick in the book in order to get a discount from you or possibly free work. And as I said, I've learned over the years that just because they're nonprofit doesn't mean they don't have money. I remember the church that I did some work for years ago tried the same thing with me, telling me that, we don't have a lot. We can't really afford too much. What can you do? And I came in and I gave them my regular price, which I was sure they were going to say, no, thank you. That's way too much. But I said, okay, well, here, this is the best I can do. And I gave them my price, which wasn't a discounted price. It was my regular price. And they didn't bat an eyelash. They just said, okay, that's perfect. Good. And they were able to pay it. No problem. They had the money for it. So I don't know if that helped you at all, Travis. If not, please send me an email. You have my contact information and we can continue this conversation elsewhere. But that's my experience dealing with nonprofits. Now, if you would like to submit your question to be considered for a future episode of the podcast, please visit resourcefuldesigner.com/feedback and fill out the form there with your question. Now, I'd like to just take a moment to thank everyone who's become a patron of Resourceful Designer. If you enjoy this podcast, if you get any value from this podcast, if you learn or are simply just entertained and you want to help support the podcast, please consider becoming a patron. For as little as $1 a month, you can help support the podcast. Visit resourcefuldesigner.com/Patreon, and that's Patreon, and sign up today. Now, before I go, I'd like to share another iTunes review I received. And this one came in from Allison Rose from Canada. It says, awesome. Such an amazing resource. I love several graphic design podcasts, but the level of preparation that goes into this and the specific pieces of advice and tricks are mind-blowing. Thank you. Well, thank you, Allison Rose. I've received reviews from 10 different countries, and all of them are amazing. But I look at my stats and I know that I am being listened to in over 150 countries. So I would love to be represented in my reviews from more countries. So if you have a minute, please head on over to resourcefuldesigner.com/iTunes, and that'll redirect you to the Resourceful Designer page in your country's iTunes store where you can leave a review for the podcast. I would love it. But that's it for this week's episode. And before I go, I just want to remind you of my tip of the week, which is sending out a thank you card. Give it a try and see how far it goes in building your client relationships. So thank you very much for listening. If you enjoyed this episode or any other episode of the podcast, please consider sharing it with a fellow graphic designer and help grow the community. Until next week, I am Mark Dacote, wishing you all the best with your graphic design business, and as always, reminding you to stay creative.
Thanks for listening to the Resourceful Designer podcast at resourcefuldesigner.com.